Hi, I'm Elliot Berman with AML RightSource, and I'm here with my colleague Jeff Fischer, who's a director in our financial crime advisory group. And we're here today to talk about risk assessments. Jeff, thanks for joining me, and let's dive right in. Why do our clients or people in the financial services universe, why should they bother to do risk assessments?
Elliot, I think when we think about risk assessments, ideally, if they're done correctly, they really help an organization to identify and evaluate potential hazards and risks that are associated with various activities or processes or situations within their organization. So this is really something that would enable an organization to evaluate its relevant risks and determine whether or not there is a sufficient or effective control environment or safeguards in place within that organization to mitigate those risks. And this ultimately allows an organization to then be able to prioritize which risks may be most significant and whether the controls are sufficient to mitigate those risks, or if perhaps you need to have some type of a corrective action plan or an improvement plan coming out of the risk assessment process to allow for the organization to potentially implement those corrective action plans and further reduce the level of risk that's present within the organization. And I think is more of a takeaway coming out of the risk assessment. If the risk assessment is done correctly, it really should serve as a valuable business intelligence tool to enable the organization to be able to make informed business decisions moving forward coming out of that risk assessment process.
That's a great point, Jeff, because certainly there are times in most organizations when someone gets asked the question, why are we doing the risk assessment? It's a regulatory expectation. And that's fine. And it's true, even though it's not a requirement, but there's a bigger, better business why. And that, as you said, making business decisions, and it can be a real valuable guide piece. So how does knowing who's going to use it, who you're writing to, if you will, when you create your risk assessment, how does that play into creating this effective, actionable document?
Yeah, Elliot, I think anytime you're going to present something or deliver something to someone, whoever it may be, really understanding who the consumer of that output is extremely critical. So really knowing that audience. And from the context of a risk assessment, it could be going to risk management professionals versus business line stakeholders. It could be going to C-suite executives or the board of directors. It could be going to regulators. And all of those kind of groups that I just alluded to are certainly not the same, and they're not going to be interested in the same types of things. If we think about it just from a risk management professional perspective, those who might be in more of the weeds of really owning and being responsible for the areas that are ultimately subject to the risk assessment, they're going to want to understand more of the details. And as I alluded to, in the weeds of what's the results, what did we learn from going through this risk assessment process, where are potentially the issues or the problems, and really being able to know it at a very detailed level and what the potential next steps are coming out of that risk assessment process. On the other hand, the C-suite or the board, for example, they're going to want maybe more of a bullet point list, the key takeaways or more of an executive summary. Here's the couple of things that are most pertinent coming out of this risk assessment. And here are the 3 or 4 things that you at more of an executive level, board level, need to know about that we within the organization are working on or acting on based on what we found and maybe the areas of most concern that need to be remediated or need to be addressed most urgently coming out of this risk assessment process.
When I was a practitioner and I primarily was working with the board of directors because of other duties that I had, one of the key questions that the board risk committee would always ask when we brought a new risk assessment in was, tell us what's changed from the last time we did this risk assessment. So a chart of the shifts, the deltas, that kind of thing was very important to them because as they evaluated the overall organization's risk appetite, they wanted to know whether the marketplace and the risk profile was changing.
Absolutely. And I think to that point, Elliot, it's also the story of where were we, where are we today? And then also maybe being able to look forward a little bit of where are we going? Are there things that we need to be mindful of coming out of this risk assessment ahead of our next risk assessment that might be changing or evolving within the institution that the stakeholders need to be aware of and mindful of.
So there's a range of risks to assess, of course, and I think that range probably impacts the process, whether you're looking at BSA AML or OFAC and sanctions or fraud or cybersecurity. So how do you see that impacting the process when you're working with clients?
Yeah, Elliot, it's certainly important, I think, to have a very clear assessment of what are the applicable risk factors or perhaps fraud schemes within a certain topic area that you're looking at. So being able to really put together and have a fairly exhaustive library of those risks or those fraud schemes, for example, to be able to look at and go through and understand what's in scope, what's out of scope, what is applicable to our organization or not applicable to our organization, and making sure that there's the ability to be able to document that and show that, because ultimately then you're able to, whether it's your internal stakeholders or even dealing again with the C-suite or the board or even your regulators, to be able to say, we really were thorough in going through and we assessed and we considered all these different risk factors, all these different fraud schemes, and maybe based on the organization, who their customer base is, the products and services they offer, the geographic exposure they have, some of those may be not applicable or not in scope. There could be some products or services that, based on the policy of the bank, could be something that they don't offer. It's against their policy to offer certain products or services, or it's against their policy to onboard certain types of customers. So being able to look at the whole library of potential risks and then be able to document and show what's in scope, what's out of scope allows, I think, an organization to be thorough and also to be able to tell the story, whether it's internally or to a regulator. Hey, we considered all these areas. Maybe we looked at 40 and only 30 of them are applicable to us, but we considered all these areas, we considered all these risks. So we've done a thorough job. We haven't overlooked something or missed something. So being able to, I think, go through that scoping exercise and being able to detail that is certainly an important step. And I think it's also important being able to show it in almost work paper form. Here's how we've gone about this, and we've done it in a thorough and thoughtful manner.
I agree. It also, I think, is one of the places where an organization can do a check to be sure they haven't unintentionally created a gap. The fraud people or the focus on fraud was in this range of things, and on BSA AML was over here, and there is some overlap. And so it's an opportunity to be sure you're covering the overlap and not creating a gap by taking that global view before you dive in.
Yeah, and Elliot, to that point also, then you alleviate we think it's being covered somewhere else, or somebody else is looking at that. And then you get into that situation where everyone's pointing back at each other and saying, our other colleagues were looking at it, and they said, we thought you were looking at it. Being able to tell that story is certainly important internally and then also potentially to a regulator as well.
And that takes us, I think, to another thing we wanted to talk about, and that's there's clearly a range of size, sophistication, and complexity of organizations. How are they organized around risk? What kind of resources have been put into risk? And that's certainly going to have an impact on their risk assessment processes and the output, and whether there's somebody in the organization that takes that global view we were just referring to before diving in. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Elliot, I think to that point, but certainly, as you alluded to, it certainly depends on organizations, their size, their complexity, their customer base, what are the products and services they're offering, where are they geographically based, but also then I think it very much reflects on the institution or the organization as a whole. What is their risk appetite? What is the level of risk that the organization is willing or comfortable to assume? And then I think the rigor and the sophistication can also depend on, has the organization maybe recently received regulatory scrutiny or questions about what they're doing in a particular area or how it conducts or goes about performing its risk assessment? I think also it will depend to a degree. Are we talking about a smaller community bank that has a very targeted geographic exposure versus a larger regional bank that has a more national stretch or national portfolio, or even a large global bank that is crossing borders and has a lot of international exposure. It also comes down to the realization that every organization is going to have some kind of budget constraint, and what are they willing to spend on that risk assessment process. And then also, I think not only just the risk assessment process, but more broadly as it relates to compliance and risk management, what are the funds, the personnel, the resources, and the time and energy and effort that they're willing to expend to go through and to have a robust compliance risk management function and risk assessment process to be able to assess and understand the risks that are in scope for them based on what they're offering, who they're serving, and what their geographic exposure and risk may be.
I think we've covered a lot of really good topics. Is there any last message you'd like to leave with our audience before we wrap up?
I think the one thing I would add, Elliot, when it comes to risk assessments, it's really about making sure that you're able to tell a story of what are we doing? What is the approach? What is the process we're taking? Having a clear methodology of how you're going about and how you're assessing that risk. It drives internal consistency within your organization, but it also allows, as you're possibly spreading the outcome or the results of that risk assessment, as I alluded to earlier, whether it's internal stakeholders or with a regulator on the outside, that there's a very consistent, repeatable, sustainable process that's being utilized within the organization to go out and to execute those risk assessments in a repeatable, sustainable manner that ultimately, when done correctly, as we had talked about at the very beginning of the conversation, allows the stakeholders to walk away with meaningful business intelligence to make informed business decisions coming out of this risk assessment process.
That methodology conversation is a good thing to summarize in the risk assessment document. So when a new reader takes a look at it, they understand what happened to generate what I'm reading.
Yep, exactly. What are the steps? What's the process? What's the approach to go from A to Z, to go from starting, collecting the information, and then ultimately being able to generate the output and the report at the end of the process.
Jeff, thanks for this conversation. I know you and I have talked about having some additional conversations about risk, and I'm looking forward to those as well. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, Elliot. Great joining you today.